All right, good evening, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, August 18th, and you happen to be back in Moscow.
Yeah, well, we enjoyed ourselves in Sochi and Kazan, Nizhny. It was a great trip. But yeah, I mean, Moscow kind of feels like home now, so it's good to be
Okay,
here.
good.
A second home.
All right, well, let's just jump straight into it. How are we
Sure.
feeling about the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska? How are you feeling?
Well, it's interesting. It seems like something really happened there, and it's kind of mysterious. First, what we do know is that Trump accepted the you could say really the main point that the Russians have been trying to make for the last year or so, and that is that okay, no ceasefire. Rather, we need to have a general peace agreement and then a ceasefire. We don't want to put the cart before the horse. And Trump has said that openly. That's what he accepts now. But that is a reversal, on the Americans' part. They have accepted Putin's position on this, and so that's clear. That much came out of this, and that's a very significant development.
Just wait,
Now,
real quick though.
yeah.
Just when you say that though, is it just Trump that has said that, or are we having more statements from the Trump administration? Because Trump just says things, so I don't want to
Yeah.
put too much stock into just something he says. Are we seeing that the machine behind Trump is
Well,
echoing
okay.
this?
I can't remember the exact words that Rubio used, but it seems like Rubio is echoing Trump on this. I don't think it's just Trump saying stuff. Again, it's always a question. Okay, that's what Trump's saying now, and maybe at least part of his administration is backing him up. But we've seen the chaos within his administration, and we've seen, the inconsistency in Trump himself. So, maybe 2 months from now, he'll be saying something else and he'll be back to where he was before. But right now, this is a change. This is not a position that was ever expressed by any member of the administration, prior to this summit meeting in Alaska. And it's a very important point. It's something that, again, um, Putin has made again, a point that Putin has made again and again, something that he's insisted upon. And that was actually a point of irritation for Trump earlier, if you remember. There was that phone call that left Trump, very upset and angry at at Putin. And, you know, part of the problem again is that Putin was saying, no, we can't have a ceasefire before we have a general agreement. So now it looks like Trump has come around to that point of view. That's significant. And I think he's, supported at least by some members of his administration in that. Let's say Witkoff is not exactly a member of his administration, but he's part of, the um, of Trump's team. Let's just put it that way. But now, what was agreed to beyond that, and maybe what concession maybe the Russians made to lead to this American reversal of their position. A story that we're hearing again and again. We heard rumors of it. At least we had one report of it prior to the summit. Actually following Witkoff's visit to Moscow a couple of weeks ago, and then since the summit, we've heard it actually from many different sources, from Reuters, the New York Times, from Axios, and then directly from Witkoff himself. And what is this that we've heard? There is this um, the an acceptance on the part of the Americans, or of Russia's claim to the territory of Donbass, which is to say Lugansk and Donetsk. This would require the Ukrainians to withdraw from Donetsk, of which they currently control about 30%. The Russians have 70% of that, and they have close to 100% of Lugansk, so that's not such a big issue. But they would have to, withdraw from the field or, the line of trees or something that they still hold within Lugansk. And then in exchange for that, this is this swap that Trump was mentioning. The Russians would withdraw from the territory they've seized in Sumy and also in the Kharkov region. which is, fairly significant, but I guess it's less than, I don't know exactly how it adds up, but we're maybe talking about less acreage than what the Ukrainians would have to give up in Donetsk. And more importantly, when we're talking about Donetsk, we're talking about major cities that they would have to surrender. There's Pokrovsk, which is under siege, and there's Konstantinovka, which is basically under siege as well. There's Seversk, which will soon be under siege. But then there are those cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are two very important cities, and they're good-sized cities, and they're also symbolically important. Slavyansk is the city where the whole thing began. I mean, the rebellion basically against the new Push regime, the regime that took power after the 2014 coup. That's where it all began. I guess it was Strelkov that led a rebellion there, and that's what led to the civil war. So it would be symbolically important, but it would also be militarily. This is very important territory. This is territory that's, again, the Donetsk is probably is a very important oblast within Ukraine, or territory of the former Ukraine for a number of reasons. One is that it's really the industrial heartland of Ukraine, with many factories, but also mines, a lot of mineral wealth, and a denser population. And then also, from the point of view, a military point of view, this is where they built up their defenses. It's really their main line of defense that's been, where they fought the hardest, where they're best able to defend against the Russian advances. The other provinces are not nearly so easy to defend. So this would be a major sacrifice on the part of the Ukrainians. But then remember, of course, that what the Russians have been saying again and again, there's the 4 oblasts that belong to them. It's not just Donetsk and Lugansk, but also Zaporozhye and Kherson. And they insisted that these, according to their constitution now that the referenda were held in these oblasts, these are part of Russia and basically non-negotiable. Now, we don't know exactly what was said, but it's kind of sounding like that Putin made a concession on these, or at least appeared to. That what these reports say is that he appeared to freeze the line, agreed to freeze the lines of contact. Just to stop the advances in Zaporozhye. Now, there haven't been any advances in Kherson because that would entail a crossing of the river, but it looks like they were perhaps preparing for a river crossing to seize at least part of the city of Kherson, and that would stop, of course. Now, this is, it's difficult. Again, the Russians themselves have not acknowledged this, so maybe these rumors are untrue. It just you wonder because they've been. They've been reappearing in different sources, and Witkoff himself, reported the same thing in an interview that was done by CNN recently, I think yesterday. Now, the Russians have not reported this themselves. There's no, statement from the Russian government to that effect. But at the same time, they're not denying it. Now, you just have to wonder, did Putin really agree to this? How could he do this? Again, after... this is the big question. It does seem like there's something afoot there. Maybe there's something that we're not hearing. I have to wonder.
Well, at the end of the day, does it really matter? Because if the Ukrainians reject this, which they will, I believe Zelensky's already said he's rejecting this,
right,
then that means the war continues and they will continue to take the land in that area. This is something that we talked about earlier. It's like perhaps the way out of this is that there's no solution that we presented that will make everybody happy. Just get something that, looks presentable, like this deal here, that it's something that is palatable to, the people in the West. I mean, I think the average person that's listening to it says, yeah, that sounds fair. That deal sounds okay. We can end the killing. So we'll agree to we'll present this deal, and we'll know that Zelensky will reject it, and so that's part of the plan. We know that that doesn't matter what we do, but we have to present something that's packageable, that's nice, that seems fair to the world. And then when the Ukrainians and the Europeans say no, then Trump can walk away. Do you think that's what's going on?
That may very well be what's going on. Yeah, that Putin, made this offer, made this apparent concession, knowing that it was not going to be accepted. It's a little bit of a gamble because if it was accepted, then how is he going to explain this? But I think he was just absolutely certain that it would be rejected, and that's Zelensky has already rejected that outright, right? Um, so yeah, that may be what it's all about. It's just like, okay, they were getting. Um, they would constantly be told by the Americans, you need to make some concessions, concessions on both sides. And by doing this, okay, by making this concession, okay, but a concession that he doesn't actually have to implement, okay, he's brought the Americans around. And the Americans now agree with his basic, position. Again, no ceasefire before a general agreement. And he's shown his willingness to bargain, a willingness to, again, to make a concession. And then, Zelensky and the Europeans are doing whatever they can to sabotage it. I think quite foolishly. You look at it from Zelensky's point of view, actually, the Ukrainians, this is a great deal. This is a lot better than you really could have hoped for. You should have just jumped on it right now and actually kind of call Putin's bluff, right? I think that would be the smart thing to do. And all you do is you lose 30% of Donetsk, which you were going to lose anyway. Let's be honest, right? Maybe it would be a few more months, at 6 months or whatever, but you're going to lose the rest of Donetsk. So why not just use that 30% that's remaining as a bargaining chip for just stopping the war and actually as stopping the advances in these other oblasts? And you were going to lose, prior to this deal, you're going to lose all four of them. And the potential, of course, that it was going to go on. And you would also lose Kharkov and Sumy and, of course, Nikolaev and Odessa. So the smart thing to do would just say, okay, yeah, call Putin's bluff. But I think he's incapable of doing, and Putin knows he's incapable of doing. So maybe that's that's the only thing that makes sense to me. The only explanation for this apparent concession, which, seemed to go against everything, which does go against really not everything, but it is something the Russians said they couldn't do, and they said it again and again. Again, this is Russian territory. We're never going to give it up. Now they say we can give up parts of these territories of Kherson and Zaporozhye. So that is a huge concession. They're saying, okay, went to the Americans, look, this is a huge concession. This is going to be hard. A lot of people in Russia are going to be unhappy about this, but we're doing this. And now the Americans can go to the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and say, hey, look, they're making this. You guys have to accept this. This is a deal that can work, but they won't. And then afterwards, the Russians can say, hey, yeah, we tried. And then and also the Americans, if Trump really wants to get out of this, and I think he clearly does. And there are people in his administration that are with him on this. Either China hawks or, for whatever reason, they just don't see the point of continuing this war. This really does give him an out. Now, like all the things I've said earlier, it's still going to be tough, but it does give him an opportunity. There's a chance that he could pull it off. I'm not sure that he can really walk away from it, but there is a door is opening that that he could potentially, push further open and just leave.
If Zelensky takes this deal, would his life be in danger? Is this the reason he doesn't want that we feel confident that he will reject any deal? Is that he needs the war to stay in power? It's kind of a similar situation with Netanyahu. He needs to keep the war going, or it's all going to fall apart for him. Is that the same situation?
Well, right. I think it is. There's no question about it. Let's say even if he did want to take the deal, he might not be able to. You're right. For the, again, like you say, there are a lot of violent people in Ukraine who would just find this completely unacceptable and you know, uh, would eliminate Zelensky. I think that there's every reason to fear that or to expect that. But I'm not at all certain. I think probably, from everything he said over the last few years, he's become kind of a true believer himself. He has internalized the Banderite way of looking at things. It's just like, again, it's better for all of Ukraine to just go down in flames than for us ever to bend the knee to the Russians, in whatever way, to actually retreat. You've seen how he's fought every one of these battles. He never retreats. Even when it makes military sense, even when there's generals like Zelensky say, we really just have to pull out to save our men and equipment and fight another day. He always tells them to fight until it's really too late. And then, the brigade or whatever that's defending the town, let's say, whatever it is largely destroyed. And so I don't see any indication that he really that he is capable of actually, withdrawing from any territory. If he can't withdraw from a single town like Uladar, is he going to actually withdraw from the rest of Donetsk? And I think that's what Putin and his people are probably looking at that and saying, yeah, he's not going to do it. So this is a cost-free concession for us. Let's make it and then, prove our good intentions, and then when he rejects it, we can move on. And we proved our good intentions both to the Americans. We'll see what they do with it. Again, it's just with Trump, it's always unpredictable, but clearly he is trying to go with it now. I think there's no question about it. But we've also shown our good intentions to the rest of the world, to our allies and friends around the world.
Right. So you think that there's basically no chance then that this Zelensky will accept this deal? So he will reject it almost certainly.
Almost certainly.
So then the war is just going to continue? Are we going to see a withdrawal of American support when there's a rejection of this plan? I mean, that's clearly the way it should go, right? Say, okay, here's the plan. We can get peace. Let's do it now. It's a great deal for Ukraine. You're going to get all this territory that you lost in Sumy and around Kharkov, and you're not going to lose all of Kherson or Zaporozhye. The Russians are going to be furious. Putin's going to have a field day on his hand if you accept this. You want to make Putin get unpopular and get ousted? Right. Take the deal. That's going to piss everybody off in Russia, but he's not going to do it. So then the logical response for the Americans is to be like, okay, then we're not going to continue funding this war because you're not accepting the deal that we negotiated. That's actually a great deal. This is the best thing you're going to get. Then what? First of all, do you think that's what we'll do? We'll actually withdraw? And then what is Zelensky going to do?
Right. Well, I think we'll see a continuation of what we've seen already. And, actually, the Americans have already been pulling away. Again, we had that statement, like, what was it, 6 weeks or 2 months ago that, hey, we're running out of these things, no more of these particular weapon systems. And then it was sort of like they fudged it, and, after there's a great outcry, they kind of implied, well, we'll try to find some more Patriot interceptors or whatever. But then it became, they say, yeah, well, we've got this arrangement with the Germans, but then they went and asked the Germans, said, well, we don't have any of these. I don't know what he's talking about. So I think the fact is, like, on certain weapon systems, there's really nothing that we can supply. It doesn't matter if you're Joe Biden or Donald Trump or anybody, and whether you want to support or the Ukrainians or not. Some weapon systems have been so depleted, some munitions have been so depleted that there's really nothing that the Americans should do, regardless of intentions. Now, for other things, there are obviously weapons and ammunition that we can continue to supply to the Ukrainians. But Donald Trump says he wants to do it. He wants the Europeans to pay for it. And I think the Europeans, a few of the countries got together and they've already agreed to buy $1.5 billion worth of U.S. military equipment for the Ukrainians. Now, with these things, you hear these deals. Okay, that's actually not much in the when you look at the the well over 100 billion, or that's been spent. It's probably well over 200 billion at this point that's been spent on the war so far. But even so, when are these weapons actually going to arrive? Are they even actually available now? Are they in stock, or do they need to be produced? There are real constraints. And it was bad even if under Joe Biden's system, they were really coming to the end, and that flow of weapons was diminishing from month to month. And again, not because the Biden administration didn't want to supply them, but the fact is that the Americans were running out. And that's not a problem that's going to go away. Now, with Trump's new system, you say, okay, yeah, we will continue to supply weapons, but the Europeans have to buy them. That just kind of throws creates new obstacles. It's not like it's undoable, but it's like I think I mentioned earlier, there are collective action problems. There's no real, solid, reliable mechanism for these purchases. You guys just have to depend on the willingness of different countries. And I think that, as we've seen in the case of Europe, that's going to break down over time. So it just looks actually very bleak for the Ukrainians. Now, when the line really collapses, and I think it will at some point, and let's say, and there's just really significant advances on the part of the Russians, much more significant, much more rapid than we've seen so far, then there's going to be such a hue and cry that there will be a tremendous amount of pressure on the U.S. administration, on the Trump administration, and there will be a lot of finger pointing. They'll say, look, you're losing Ukraine. It was because of you, even though it really might not have been because of, it really didn't matter so much, because in the end, because there are these physical constraints, there's limits to what the U.S. can supply. But that the finger will be pointed at Trump, and they'll say that it's because of what you did. This you stabbed the Ukrainians in the back. You didn't. It used to be as long as it takes, but you gave up on them. You left them stranded, and now you've got an Afghanistan on your hands. And it's going to be really hard for Trump to not to do something. That's something that we've talked about, and we just don't know. We'll see. We'll see. But I guess the best thing, of course, is I think for Ukraine and for everybody, is that if Trump just sticks to his guns and said, no, this is your problem. We had a deal. You guys sabotaged the deal. You refused to take it. Don't come screaming to me. We'll see if he can hold the line. That would be great if he does. I'm not sure that he can. That he will be able to when the time comes.
And what are the Europeans? How are they behaving? European leaders? They're clearly very upset. Is there anything that you think that they can try to do to sabotage or? I mean, the thing is, they can't do. That's the problem. Zelensky, nobody can do anything. I mean, it's amazing for, the Russians. They don't have to make any concessions. They're in the driver's seat. This is why Putin making these concessions to not take all these Kherson and Zaporozhye is such a great deal for them. You think that they would recognize that?
Yeah, no, yeah, obviously they don't. They're deluded, and you're asking what they're doing. Well, they're basically all the leaders, presidents of the most important countries are in Washington, D.C. right now, getting ready to meet with Trump, I think in just like a couple of hours from now.
But what do they want Trump to do?
I think they simply want him to make sure that he goes back to, returns to his previous position, which was in line with the Europeans, ceasefire first. And of course, the idea of a ceasefire first is just really a chance to give the Ukrainians, who are falling apart right now, to put things back together, to get a breather, to rearm. That's the hope. And then, but not to make any kind of concessions, basically, when it comes down to it. It's just, they, I know it's absurd because it's completely unrealistic. But that's been their position all along, and they are clearly, they're again talking about sending peacekeepers or what they call reassurance troops or something, some nonsense like that. Um, and that promise to send the peacekeepers actually is something is that promise itself sabotages any kind of peace agreement because the Russians are not going to stand for that. That's basically what they wanted. They've been trying to prevent all along. So this promise that the instant there's a ceasefire, we'll send Russian, French troops or British troops. Those are two countries that have promised to do that. That would be immediately would derail any kind of agreement. So that's their purpose is to derail any kind of agreement, which just seems really nutty. They've actually got the weaker hand. So what are they trying to do? They just don't seem to understand that they have the weaker hand, or they just can't believe that they have the weaker hand. They just believe that somehow, we are the West. America is America. We can't possibly lose this war. So don't give up. We have to fight to the end because we're just bound to win because we're the West.
How have the summit and all this talk about a potential peace deal, is it affecting movements on the ground? Are we seeing an acceleration for Russia, or is it business as usual? Or are they kind of holding off until we get a clear message from the Europeans and Zelensky or Trump about this plan?
Well, I don't think we're seeing any change on it hasn't had any impact whatsoever on the battlefronts. Um, Now, what's happening. Of course, there's that big breakthrough to the north of Pokrovsk. The Russians just broke through, went 10, 11 kilometers in a day. The the Ukrainians really panicked, and what I've heard, they've sent at least a half a dozen brigades to to counterattack at the salient, established by the Russians, and they managed to push the Russians back a bit, at the tip of the salient, which is not surprising. I mean, but as other analysts have pointed out, this is actually not a demonstration of Ukrainian weakness. If you got to send like a half a dozen brigades to it, would your best brigades, actually, we're talking about the most experienced there, um, and best armed units, and pull them off of other critical points on the front line, like right there at Konstantinovka. That shows actually how weak your position is. So what we've seen is that, okay, things have slowed down right there in Pokrovsk because the Ukrainians are throwing everything into it, but they've actually sped up in other places like Seversk and Konstantinovka. Because again, those brigades were pulled away from those lines, and now the Russians are advancing. So I don't think it's had any impact on the front line. I think there has been maybe there was an impact, or has been an impact on the air war. That it seems to me the Russians have slowed down, their nightly attacks, the missile and drone attacks over the last week or so. We haven't seen as many. And that may be just sort of a nod to the Americans, a temporary slowdown, just to try to avoid any incidents that could be used to kind of derail the a potential agreement. Now, and then on the other hand, the Ukrainians have been, over this last week or two, have been actually intensifying their attacks, their drone attacks on especially neighboring regions, places like Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk, and have their targets almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely civilian. And they have killed quite a few civilians in those regions over the last week or two. It's a daily thing. And I think it's just like from their perspective, this is what you always see whenever there's some sort of negotiations, a potential of some sort of agreement between the U.S. And the Russians. They always seem to intensify these attacks on civilians. And I suppose if they're looking for a logic, the idea is that they're trying to provoke the Russians into overreacting in a way that would derail the talks. That that seems foolish, but maybe there's that logic, or it's just maybe just anger. It's just like a lot of what the Ukrainians do, especially their attacks on civilians. I don't think there really is a rationality behind it. It's just this nihilistic hatred. But we do seem to be seeing that, again, in the last 2 weeks or so.
Before we started recording, you mentioned about some strikes on some missile production facilities. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, okay. It was, I think, the Sapsan, okay, Sapsan missile. Okay, this was something that the Ukrainians, it was said, were developing themselves. And they had, I think, with four enterprises, two in Sumy, two in Dnipropetrovsk, and they had production lines set up. And it was some kind of, it's just described as a long-range missile. Now, it was also mentioned in the stories about it that there was maybe German involvement in this project, German oversight. So you wonder, there was this story I think that came out a few months ago that the Germans were going to help the Ukrainians develop a missile and produce it within Ukraine, and this may be very well what that story was about. Now, again, with these missile strikes, apparently the Russians have just completely destroyed this project. Um, but there was a similar story that came out. They said there was some missile called the Flamingo, which was supposed to have a cruise missile of with a range of 3,000 kilometers, and it was, according to the Associated Press, developed by Ukraine. But I have a more than sneaking suspicion that the Germans or maybe the Americans, the British, were actually very heavily involved in this. And I think we can see that maybe this is a new strategy after the attempt to use ATACMS. Well, that was shelved. First of all, it wasn't successful. Let's be honest, it did very little. But it also did risk serious retaliation and escalation by the Russians. Um, and the Trump administration seems to have put an end to this. So maybe this is an alternative strategy. Okay, well we're going to have Ukrainian developed missiles, which maybe really aren't Ukrainian developed, but that's what we can present them as, and therefore we can avoid the risk of escalation. We can have a cruise missile fired from Ukraine, and we say, well, this was a Ukrainian missile. It hit Moscow, but it has nothing to do, with NATO. So Russia, you have no reason to strike a NATO base or anything. I think that's maybe what we're seeing. This is a new tack that they're taking, and the Russians have at least apparently have completely, obliterated this one target. This other one, the Flamingo missile, is more mysterious. I don't know where it's happening, and it maybe not even in Ukraine, but they're trying to pretend that it's Ukrainian. We'll see. But it shows that there are elements in the West that haven't given up on escalation.
I also saw on the news that Russia blew up some Azerbaijani gas station in Odessa. Did you see that?
Yeah,
Is there
right.
something? Is there something going on here? Because I know Azerbaijan supplies gas to Israel, and we have Azerbaijan and Armenia with the Zanzibar corridor. Something fishy is going on there. It looks like these two countries in the Caucasus are being used as part of this U.S. hegemonic proxy mission to either attack Russia or Iran. Is there some kind of relationship between these three countries, Azerbaijan, Israel, Ukraine? This seems to be like our axis of evil that are being funded and controlled by the globalists, the U.S. hegemonic elite.
Oh, yeah, there's no question that there's a very tight relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan. Yeah, I think 70% of weapons, of Azerbaijani, weaponry actually uh, have been purchased in Israel so far. They have a very tight relationship. The Israeli intelligence, I think, is deeply involved in Azerbaijan. And again, there was indications that attacks were carried out from Azerbaijani territory against Iran during the recent 12-day war. Um, yeah, Azerbaijan and Israel are very, very tight. Now, and Israel also supports Ukraine. I don't know if they're really a very important supporter of Ukraine, but they have supported Ukraine in this war. Now, Azerbaijan is clearly supporting Ukraine. Um, Up until recently, up until like a month ago or so, the Russians um, actually avoided striking the Azerbaijan-owned facilities in Ukraine. And I think maybe there was a hope that this, Russian goodwill would be reciprocated by Azerbaijan, but then it became clear that it wasn't. And so the Russians have decided, not to spare these facilities. In general, they've been striking the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. That's part of their, strategy of just weakening the military-industrial complex, such as it is in Ukraine. And they had made an exception for Azerbaijan, but it's just clear that Azerbaijan wasn't reciprocating. Was leaning strongly towards Ukraine, and 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 I think there's more than that. We had that the arrests of Azerbaijani criminals within Russia, and these criminals, were part of criminal, networks apparently. And there's some talk that maybe these criminal networks actually worked with the Ukrainians, like, for example, during the Operation Spiderweb and maybe other operations
Right.
within Russia. So I think the Russians decided, like, to hell with it. There's just no, that we're, we're not getting any benefit from, nothing but anything but goodwill from the Azerbaijanis. So, okay, yeah, we'll start. So that's why we're seeing the strikes on their facilities.
Is that a potential flashpoint though? If Russia starts attacking, Azerbaijani facilities. I mean, Azerbaijan is a small country, but this is another U.S. proxy. I mean, part of me is wondering, it's like the U.S. might just be trying to compartmentalize things. They're thinking like, okay, well, we were trying to deal with Iran and Yemen and China and everything, so let's just stop Ukraine, and then but we can't. We got to strengthen our other proxies. Is that something
Uh,
that you think
yeah,
that
well,
might
it shows,
be
I think, that,
at least the
yeah,
mindset of some people?
right. Yeah, I think maybe, yeah, there's no reason to think that in general, the kind of the project to weaken and contain Russia is going to come to an end. Say, Ukraine was the main part of that project, but that has clearly failed. And so the more realistic members of the U.S. government, of the foreign policy and military elite there are coming to terms with that. Um, but I don't think there's any reason to think that they're going to stop all their other projects, in the South Caucasus, for example, and places like, Azerbaijan, that they will continue there. Now we had that deal that, well, it was not quite a deal. This is important to recognize. There was a deal that was made between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That a peace treaty was basically signed for them, which was really very much in the favor of Azerbaijan. And then there was a statement of intent. It was really no more than that, on the creation of the so-called Zangezur corridor, along um, the southern border of Armenia, where Armenia borders Iran. And the idea, of course, was to lease this southern strip of territory to the U.S. for 99 years. Now, but that hasn't happened, and maybe it never will. One thing is, like, we've seen all these deals, so many of these deals that Trump has made, and there's always, it's this, whether it's with the Japanese or the Europeans or whoever, whomever, there's always this very bombastic statement by Trump. He's made this incredible deal. There will be hundreds of billions of dollars investment and so on and so forth. And then when you look at it carefully, you find, well, actually, there's some talk of it, but there's actually no concrete promises, or no real treaty signed, and maybe in some cases really no means to implement these promises, or to make sure that the promises are implemented. So both Armenia and Azerbaijan's declared this intent. And maybe it really will happen, but maybe it won't. We'll see. If it does, then yeah, it does spell trouble especially for Iran. That you would have the opportunity for the U.S. to put, its assets directly on the border with Iran there. Again, no deal has been made yet, but it is very threatening to Iran, and it does threaten, Russia's position in the region. Russia has military bases in Armenia now. But it looks like that those spaces will not remain for long.
Interesting. So we know that there's a close relationship between Azerbaijan and Israel. The relationship between Ukraine and Israel, I feel like there's something there, but I'm not sure. And one of the reasons I feel that way is because when I was looking at previous prime ministers of Israel, most of them are from the Ukraine. And Zelensky's half Jewish as well. It seems like there are a lot of Ukrainians living in Israel. There are a lot of Ukrainians, a lot of Russians as well. But I just feel like maybe I'm wrong, but we talk about CIA and MI6 involvement in Ukraine, but I have a feeling that maybe Israel, they operate in the shadows a lot. I wonder how heavily involved is Mossad, and if how much of the U.S. foreign policy is being dictated by by Israel. At least we know it is in the Middle East, but is it being influenced beyond that? That there's this merging between the Zionists, our U.S. hegemonist as well. They're just I feel like there's something there, but maybe I'm wrong.
You may be right. Again, it's like you say, these are things happening in the shadows, so we just don't know. There clearly is a relationship, and the Israelis have been supportive of Ukraine, but they haven't been one of the major supporters of Ukraine, and they have tried to maintain at least minimally decent relations with the Russians. Now, their relationship with Russia has been strained, really, ever since October 7th, but it hasn't broken. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see how it would be really very much in the interests of Israel to get too much involved in Ukraine. This is, maybe there's something there, especially like if there may be some give and take, like the Americans ask for Israeli help, or the Ukrainians, and the Israelis will do a favor because they know they can get a favor in return. Maybe that kind of thing is probably happening in the shadows. So I don't know what exactly is happening.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's move over a little bit to Israel. You were saying as well earlier before we started the conversation about these huge protests in Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there were some major protests. I think the largest in at least a year in Tel Aviv. At least 100,000, and maybe 300,000 people went out on the streets. But there were major protests in other cities in Israel, and altogether, so we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. And what they're demanding is a ceasefire and a return of the hostages. That's what it's all about. It's the hostages, and what everybody understands is that really the only way to get the hostages back, to be sure that they can get them back, is through a ceasefire. That's how, so far that's the hostages that have been released. Again, we call them hostages, but let's be honest, many of them are simply prisoners of war. We fall into this use, like the on the the Palestinians prisoners. We refer to them as prisoners. Many of them are, I think, fairly could be called hostages. The people that are just simply seized by the Israelis, without charges. A great, I think the majority of them, in fact, are. And then in the case of the Israelis, well, These are soldiers, many of them, the majority of them, who are seized in a military operation. Normally, we call them prisoners of war. Somehow, we always call them hostages in Israel. Um, they call them hostages. I think they're more fairly called prisoners of war. And there are maybe 25 or so remaining that are known to be alive. Um, and that's what these protests are about. There's a real focus in Israeli society, a great part of Israeli society on the hostages. And, that's been a point of contention between Netanyahu and his coalition. That's been a sort of a vulnerable point, because so many people are upset about that. And he has clearly been, pursuing policies that are not conducive to the return of the hostages. The continuation of the war satisfies the extremist elements in his coalition, and I think of his own ambitions. But it doesn't. It clearly makes less likely the return of the hostages. So this is something that he's vulnerable on. But there are a lot of Israelis who really want those hostages back, and he's feeling the pressure. But I don't think he's going to. So far, he's showing no signs of caving in. He still has this plan to occupy Gaza City. I think the worry is that the occupation of Gaza City will lead to the deaths of more hostages. And that's quite possible. Of course, these protesters, unfortunately, don't seem to be concerned about they're very concerned about the 25 Israeli prisoners of war, but they're not concerned about, the many thousands, tens of thousands of, and even you could say hundreds of thousands of Palestinian lives that will be endangered by this operation.
Yeah, it's when we talk about Israeli society, something that sticks out to me is just really how powerful the tribe mentality is in Israel. That there will be such strong protests to get these 25 hostages back or prisoners of war back. Most of them are IDF soldiers, but they have no concern for the people that are not part of their tribe, the non-Jews. It's so strange to me that it's that strong. It's like, you don't know, most of these people are protesting, they have no personal connection to these hostages or these prisoners of war in Gaza. They don't know them personally. They don't know the children in Gaza, but they will protest and fight and everything just for these people that were, many of them were IDF soldiers that were in charge of enclosing Gaza, keeping it at the concentration camp that it is. And they will be very upset and protest about that, but they have no feeling for these children, all these people that are starving to death, that are dying. It's very strange. I just, having a tribe, I think, is important, but I've never seen it so extreme. And I think that's
Right.
it is unique, I feel, with the Jewish people. It is it's a strong drive. It's just like that overrides everything. That idea of just, we back our tribe no matter what, and screw everybody else. We don't care.
Yeah, well, it is. I think there clearly is an ideology that is developed in Israel. I think, I'm sure it has deeper historical roots, but I'm not the person to really to. I don't have a full understanding. I'll just put that. But clearly, in ever since the launch of the Zionist project, I think the Israeli society, initially it was just certain aspects of Jewish society, but now we're talking about Jewish Israeli society has been put on this trajectory that does value, Jewish lives. To say, more than other lives, it's not really saying much, because I think you could say that about any tribe or any people in the world. I think that's natural. It's like you first, you're more concerned with your family members, and then by extension, your nation. But there is something that goes way beyond this, where clearly for many, many Jewish Israelis, the lives of other people just actually don't count for anything. I mean, that's how else can you explain it? You're talking about these massive protests for 25. So, and every day, many more than that die are killed, in the most horrible manner. Um, Innocent people are killed, people trying to obtain aid to save their starving families, children who are just, have been targeted by a sniper or whatever. This is something that happens every single day in Gaza, and it's happened for the last, we're getting close to 700 days now, well over 600 days. And you, it seems, this is not just a thought or an impression. This is what the polling shows. Okay, something like 75% apparently of Israeli society wants to see these hostages brought home. But then it also, on the other hand, we get approximately 80% just really don't care about starvation in Palestine. It doesn't matter to them. That's what they tell the pollsters. And we've seen it. It's just there is this complete disregard of other lives, and that's the way that Israel has treated its neighbors. It's just we've talked about it. I don't really need to go into detail. It's I'm not going to put it at the feet of Judaism because I just don't know enough about it, and I think it's a mistake to do that without a real understanding. I know I hear people make comments about
For sure.
Christianity. They for example, you look at Christian Zionism and you say Christians are just crazy and they want to kill too, because unfortunately a large number of Christians are going down the same road. I don't know that that this is something that's just symptomatic of Judaism, but it certainly is symptomatic of Zionism. And this is, it is a project that clearly, puts more than just puts more value on Jewish lives, but it really does. It's part of like central to the thing. It is a form of supremacism, of ethnic supremacism, that has become intensified over the years. That was always, it was always there, that ethnic supremacism, and now it's become, taken very, very ugly and extreme form.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I was wanting to explore a bit is how does that ethnic supremacism take root and really become so extreme like it did in Israel? Because you have so many nations around the world that are homogenous. We have you go to spend time in East Asia, you go to Japan, they're all Japanese. You go to Korea, they're Korean. Sure, you're always a foreigner. You're never really assimilated in society. Even me living in China for 10 years, but you never feel that the Chinese or the Japanese or the Koreans have any you don't see this ethno supremacism. You don't feel like even though they're all one people, they don't have this. You don't feel that at all. It's not there. So I don't know why is it. It's scary. Where does that come from? Where is it that root, this idea that, you're better and you can treat other humans that are not part of your tribe as just subhuman. That's
Well,
not an okay ideology. That shouldn't be,
right.
it could be allowed in society. You think that just through societal evolution, that would have been pushed out, that type of thinking, because you don't see it sprouting up in these other
Yeah.
countries, I mean, in these other nations,
Right.
there's always different ethnic minorities or visitors or whatever, and they're treated fine
Right. Well,
for the
of
most
course,
part.
it's
I mean,
important to look at like the Japanese because I think what you say about them is generally true. Now there is I think
World War
even now
II.
kind of a
Okay.
dark side to Japanese society, but but in general, right, the Japanese have adopted a completely different attitude vis-a-vis other people. They're very concerned about maintaining their Japaneseness, but they're trying to be civilized members of the Society of Nations, so they have abandoned the pursuit of ethno supremacy. But there was, of course, a time, where they very much pursued that policy, with horrific results in places like China and Korea. So it shows that these political projects they can arise in different contexts, and but they can be defeated. It eventually was defeated in Japan, but it just has risen in Israel. And, there are various, again, I think you have to, part of the problem is the U.S. support for these for the extremist elements within Israel. if the U.S. didn't continually support Israel, regardless of what it did, if it actually pressured them, the Israelis to make a deal with the Palestinians, let's say back in after the Six-Day War, for example, I think they would have had no choice, to do it. And also, it's just that those extremist elements, which were, they were always there, but they were kind of lurking in the background and the fringes of Israeli society in the past. They would have remained there in the fringes, but they were empowered by the unconditional support from the U.S. It's just like over time, they developed a sense of impunity, and within Israeli society began to see, like, what are we afraid of? It's just like, it seems like the people who are advocating moderation with Israel, are constantly, when push comes to shove, they're warning against the dangers of extremism, but then the extremists make a move and they're supported by the Americans. They launch an invasion and the Americans are with them. It empowers the extremists. And over time, it's, that has become, they have become, rather than a fringe, the dominant force within Israeli society. Again,
So we created this monster.
It would have been possible without the American role.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. So you think that in large part we created this monster and our continued support.
I wouldn't say okay. To create it, they're there, but we've empowered them. They were always there, and by backing them, by never, saying no, we have empowered them. We've fed the monster. And, we didn't create the monster, but we fed it, and it's become, now it's.
Yeah, we've made it what it is today. I mean, as you think about, just even the idea of ethno-supremacism, I'm sure there was always a bit of that. Just the founding of Israel is there, there is a bit of ethno-supremacism in there just from the beginning. But just think about the U.S. continual support, especially when Christian Zionists, and you have people like Lindsey Graham saying, if you pull the plug on Israel, then God's going to pull the plug on us. It's like, we are telling them that you're God's chosen people. We're praying for you. We get these things in the mail. Are you going to pray for Israel? Donate $10 to help Israel to achieve God's vision. And so America is feeding that. Mm-hmm. That whole notion of supremacism, that you guys are God's chosen people. It's your duty, your biblical right to go and kill these people and take their land. Like so much of it is our fault. Like if we didn't have, but I mean, I know that in a large part though, that Christian Zionist movement was created by, I would say created. I know Christian Zionism predates actual Zionism, but it was things I think fostered in many ways by the Zionists say, hey, this is great. Yeah. Let's put in, let's get the Schofield Bible out there. Let's let them start worshiping us. We are the Jews. It's sick. It's pathetic that we did this.
Right. Well, I think, again, it is important to point out, as you did, just that Christian Zionism predates Zionism. And I think, during the first several decades of Christian Zionism, there actually isn't really any evidence, or very, very little evidence of any sort of significant Jewish support for it. I think that comes more recently. Now, there's no question, but that people like Netanyahu and all his allies and supporters, both within Israel and the U.S., see Christian Zionism as, a very useful force, and they support it, and they feed it. But it's something, again, they didn't create, but they've kind of, we're looking at sort of the mirror image of what the U.S. did in Israel. They're helping to feed the beast within the U.S.
I feel like Christian Zionism is collapsing in the United States. I hope I'm right. I feel like people like Tucker Carlson are really helping with that, because he's always coming at it as as a Christian, and he's interviewing Christians in Palestine. And another great person is actually Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't think many people had Marjorie Taylor Greene as the most humane congresswoman, the one that would actually be. She is really out there, and she was sharing videos on her X of babies that have been injured from the shrapnel and from the bombs, and just horrific stuff, and just saying how just evil. It's crazy that this is a brave position to take for our politicians, to call out, seeing a baby obliterated. I saw a video of a little girl carrying water, trying to get family, just drone strike, intentionally just like, no, come on, guys. This is, can we get any more black and white on good versus evil? Like, this is evil. This is evil. We have to stand up and speak about it, speak out against it. And so few of our politicians. But Marjorie Taylor Greene is actually one of those surprise ones, and she's getting a lot of support from all sides, because people are human, and when we say that, yes, thank you for some politician, some political leader to stand up and say condemn what is obviously wrong, what is obviously evil. And there are more and more things just breaking through. I don't know if you saw the story. There was this, I think that guy name was Tom Alexandrovich or something like this. He's the executive director of cybersecurity for Israel on Netanyahu's cabinet. And he was in Vegas for something, the Israelis come here all the time, do things. And he was arrested in a pedophile sting because he was trying to have sex with some underage girl. And, it was a FBI agent. And then he gets arrested for it. There's police documents. And then on behalf of the Trump administration, he is released and sent back to Israel. And okay, no problem. And of course, no mainstream media and here we're talking about it. But, you throw a sandwich at a police officer because they're arresting somebody that is protesting against the genocide in Gaza, or you're Pam Bondi saying, I'm on it with Randy Fine because some college student is upset with arguing with some Zionist or something like this. They're all over that. But here you have an Israeli, pedophile here trying to rape American children, and he gets arrested for it, and then you just let him go. Like, it's just getting to the point where people are just like, it's just a farce. What sick country is this? Who's in charge? And we start to know the answer.
Well, it has to be pointed out that Marjorie Taylor Greene, highlighted that story and denounced.
Yeah, she did.
Right. So again, kudos to her. It's shameful. And at the same time, the Trump administration has now banned or prevented the medical visas to sick Gazan or wounded, dying Gazan children into the U.S. And that was celebrated by Randy Fine.
Of course. Yeah, no, it's so amazing that we, when we're the ones, it's our bombs that are doing this to these kids. And then we won't even, after we blow them up, we won't even put them back together. It's it's really out of control. This is the Ukraine war is huge, and I know it is completely changed geopolitics, the balance of power, the entrance in the multipolar world. This is hugely significant. But I just feel like what's happening in Gaza it's even bigger, because that moral stain on the West, that's something that will last forever. This is something that will be in our history books, just like the Germans were with World War II. We do it. This is our chapter, guys. This is it. Right. We are complicit in genocide, the most documented public genocide of all time.
Right.
That's just openly stated by politicians in Israel. They just openly state that this is their plan. And we're somehow still making excuses almost 2 years later.
Very true.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, anything you want to add, Dad? We can end it here.
Okay. Yeah, I think that this is a good place to end. The next time we communicate, if everything works out, I'll be in Istanbul, just for a day, basically. A little more than a day.
Okay.
But I should be in Istanbul on Wednesday.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, we'll be flexible with your schedule, and then you'll be back to the U.S. It'll be nice to have you back here again. It's not having the grandparents, you and Mom around to help with the little kids. It's starting to get a little. We're doing fine. Okay. We're doing fine, but it'll be nice to drop them off with you guys for a little bit.
Yeah, we miss them.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Dad. Well, have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you when you're in Istanbul.
Okay. Very good.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.